Только помню, накрыла голову руками и кричала: «Боже, помоги нам, Боже, помоги нам». И казались эти взрывы бесконечные, что они никогда не кончатся, что это вот оно взрывается, взрывается, взрывается. И так страшно мне не было никогда.
Це, що ми бачили, що ще було там на землі і частини тіла людей, ну це страшно.
Добили до того, что я стал овощем.
Заходили в дом, надевали мешок, начинали избивать с дома, потом мародерили, выносили все.
Це справжнє пекло. Пекло в тому вигляді, в якому малюють на старовинних іконах.
Когда папу забрали, я вообще пытался не думать об этом. Они потом второй раз повторили: хочешь в приемную семью или в приют.
2-3 години ти взагалі стоїш голий, холодно, просто замерзаєш. Ну, а зараз підемо, там річка рядом, попливеш і стріляти не треба, там втопишся.
Після чергового бомбового удару рашистів бачимо розруйнований навпіл. Коли розкопували тут, то виявили десь близько 47 тіл, які з живцем практично були поховані під цими уламками і камінням.
My name is Peter Pomerantsev, and I'm one of the founders and directors of the Reckoning Project.
The Reckoning Project is a small team of war crime investigators inside Ukraine, all Ukrainian, almost all women because the men, sadly, are on the front line.
The Reckoning Project was born in the immediate days and weeks after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. We knew that journalists would be the first on the scene. Journalists are always the first on the scene.
The whole public interest journalism team was involved in reporting the full-scale invasion since the first minutes of the war. When, Kherson has been liberated, we were there the first to see what was happening at the torture chambers. When Izium has been liberated, to go there to see the mass burial, to find the people who would tell the stories.
The Reckoning Project gathers evidence from war crimes and atrocities, then creates stories for media, while at the same time building legal cases around these atrocities.
We are lawyers, we are storytellers, we are journalists, we are activists, we are data scientists. We have all come together with a common mission, and that mission is to eradicate impunity.
My name is Ibrahim Olabi. I am an English barrister, a lawyer, and I am the chief legal counsel for the Reckoning Project. Journalists are often the first at the scene collecting witness statements, but if they do it in a way that harms the legal integrity later, that can have an impact on accountability. On the other hand, lawyers like to keep everything confidential and work very quietly, but that doesn't let you realize the impact of accountability, because deterrence is best achieved when the public knows about it. So you have a court of law and you have a court of public opinion, and the Reckoning Project brings these two together.
My name is Raji Amin Khalid Abdussalam. I am the Chief Legal Archivist and Data Analyst in the Reckoning Project. No one stopped the Russians in Grozny. They moved to Syria and they did the same atrocities and in bigger scale in Syria. And then they moved to do bigger atrocities in Ukraine because no one stopped them in Syria and no one took them to court. The Russians do wars against population. They look at them as an entities that should be subdued. Either you are subdued or you die.
I've been a war reporter for more than 30 years. In that time, I witnessed 3 genocides, and I've seen countless, dozens of bad guys walk away after committing the most cruel acts, crimes against humanity, and war crimes.
So Janine is someone who's been called to The Hague numerous times. And it always happens many, many years after the event. And she would be asked to come to The Hague and to other tribunals and to prove that these atrocities had taken place and who was responsible.
Often, human rights investigators, war crime investigators took years to get on the ground to investigate atrocities. By the time they got there, the war was over. Witnesses began to age, die, or fade away into villages, or their memories were gone.
She really birthed this idea of let's train journalists right from the start to gather evidence in a way that is timely and that is good enough for courts of law as well.
States cannot commit crimes on their own. They're not living beings. They're made up of the living beings that make them up, and these are individuals who are led by Putin.
Putin and other dictators like him want to show the world that they have full impunity, but they also want to bend the truth about what's happening. They have vast disinformation machines which undermine the reality. There's already coordinated media campaigns emanating from Russia claiming that Bucha never happened, that it was staged. Some of this can sound absurd right now, but we've seen how this relentless disinformation starts to eat away at the edifice of truth. That's why what we're doing as we work is creating a lasting body of facts and a lasting memorial to what took place.
Justice delayed is justice denied. We're doing it for all the people that do not have a voice, that do not have power. Those people in Donetsk, in Mariupol, in Chernihiv, in Yahidny, all of those people who have suffered and who are traumatized and who are unable to tell their story at a larger level.
All the expertise is within the Ukrainian community to serve the Ukrainian people, to serve Ukrainian objectives. And this is important to me because the property of the Reckoning Project goes back to the Ukrainian people.
We've already done large multimedia feature stories for magazines like Vanity Fair, The Atlantic. We were on the front cover of Time, our story about Yahidne. We also present our media content and our stories to policymakers. So we have done screenings and given evidence at Congress, at the Senate in America, at the British Parliament, at the UN.
This is a way of not erasing what happened in Ukraine, but of ensuring that all of the suffering, all of the pain will somehow be rectified in a small way with justice. Above all, what the Reckoning Project wants is justice.
Добрий вечір, вітаю. Good evening, welcome to the Ukrainian Institute. My name is Andrew Horodisky. I'm a board member and advisor to the Institute's art programming and also select cultural presentations. I have the distinct honor and pleasure to work alongside our president, Kathy Novaiko, and executive director, Lydia Zeininger, and I'm immeasurably grateful for their counsel, support, and friendship. The continued presentation of these events would not ultimately be possible without you, the audience, who continue to show your curiosity, thirst for cultural material, whether light and entertaining or informative and sobering. Following tonight's presentation, we invite you to pose some questions for our guests in a brief Q&A, and then join us for a light reception for further meaningful engagement. In the midst of celebrating our 75th anniversary of fulfilling our mission to serve the Ukrainian diaspora, local and regional public audiences, elected officials in their offices, and the Foreign Service Corps in presenting the best Ukraine and Ukrainians have to offer through cultural diplomacy, we find our mission most urgent now during the war. Today, we pass the 600th day since the Russian invasion and attack on Ukraine and Ukrainian nation. Names of towns and villages such as Bakhmut, Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, and hroza have become synonymous with the worst possible images of hell on earth. Numbers and statistics aside, however vital they are to the administrative, legal, and civil open society, Ukrainians, both military and civilian, have endured an indescribable physical and mental trauma, death, displacement, destruction and looting of their treasured cultural heritage, and fallen to some of the most horrific atrocities one human can inflict upon another with extreme prejudice. Whether the former is human is hardly debatable. In honor of those who have fallen in Ukraine, active duty defenders and innocent civilians, and most recently those in Israel and Gaza, please join me in standing for a moment of silence. Thank you. I'd like to begin and end these remarks with two quotes for your mindful consideration, one of which have been repeated in the video. People are only capable of great heroism when they believe something passionately. An abstract principle is not enough to be heroic. It has to be something which is emotional and deeply motivated. This first quote aptly describes our two special guests who come to us motivated by compassion for the human spirit and its accompanying inalienable rights. Decades of practice in the disciplines of war correspondence, scholarship, and activism with an innate ability for not only storytelling, but uncompromising truth-telling. The Reckoning Project is an NGO comprised of journalists, lawyers, researchers, data scientists, and activists with the primary focus of documenting war crimes in Ukraine through personal testimony. The initiative was launched after the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 to promote accountability for war crimes committed in Ukraine through the collection of testimonies for use in prosecutions and for public dissemination of domestic and international audiences. The project involves training Ukrainian journalists and researchers to collect evidence throughout the country. So far, more than 30 Ukrainian journalists and researchers have been trained. To date, the Reckoning Project has gathered over 350 testimonies, which have shed light on war crimes. The project has made submissions to the OSCE Moscow Mechanism reports and to the International Criminal Court regarding Russia's forced transfer of children. The Reckoning Project also draws on testimonies to memorialize these experiences and strengthen public support for justice globally in an effort to end impunity. The project's stories and films have been featured in publications such as Time Magazine, The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, Foreign Policy, on NPR, and CNN. The European Union collaborates with civil society organizations such as the Reckoning Project to ensure that war crimes committed in Ukraine by Russia are punished and Russia compensates for the damage it has wrought. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has brought death, devastation, and suffering to Ukraine's citizens. As of the present date, Ukraine's Prosecutor General has registered over 109,180 war crimes, excluding numerous yet to be unregistered atrocities in the temporarily occupied territories. Through accountability efforts, the EU strives to ensure that war crimes committed in Ukraine do not go unpunished. While continuing to support the work of the ICC, the EU Commission, together with the international community and civil society, has established a tribunal to investigate and prosecute Russia's crime of aggression. The testimonies collected by the Reckoning Project not only ensure that the suffering of Ukrainian people remains in the public eye, but also provide essential evidence for a tribunal to hold Russia accountable for its war crimes and crimes against humanity. A war crime is a violation of international and customary laws governing the conduct of warfare and armed conflict. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court defines war crimes as grave breaches of the Geneva Convention of the 12th of August 1949, which includes behaviors such as torture, willfully causing great suffering and body harm, and extensive destruction and appropriation of property, not justified by military necessity. The Geneva Conventions were designed especially to protect civilians and non-combatants. The conventions also regulate the treatment of sick and wounded combatants, treatment and repatriation of prisoners of war, and the protection for hospitals. War crimes in general refer to intentionally causing excessive destruction and intentionally harming or killing civilians or prisoners of war. This includes rape, sexual violence, torture, genocide, and forced displacement, as we have witnessed. Janine di Giovanni has worked as a human rights reporter and investigator in conflict zones in the Balkans, Africa, and the Middle East. She is a Tom and Andy Bernstein Human Rights Visiting Fellow at Yale Law School, the Yale Law School Shell Center for Human Rights, a Senior Fellow at Yale University, the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, and a Visiting Fellow at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. She is a 2019 Guggenheim Fellow in Nonfiction, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters awarded her the highest prize for nonfiction, the Blake Dodd, for her lifetime body of work. In 2016, she was awarded the Courage in Journalism Award for her distinguished work tracking war criminals, most recently in Syria and Iraq, with a focus on ISIS. Di Giovanni is also the author of 9 books, including Madness Visible, The Vanishing, and The Morning They Came for Us, Dispatches from Syria, which is a collection of war testimonials translated into 30 languages. She has made numerous documentaries and is a frequent analyst on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and the BBC. Di Giovanni is the recipient of nearly a dozen journalistic awards, including 2 Amnesty International awards, the National Magazine Award for her work in human rights and war reporting. She has worked for the United Nations on different initiatives, most recently directing Enabling Witnesses in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, in partnership with the United Nations Democracy Fund and the Sufan Group. Peter Pomerantsev is a senior fellow at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where he co-directs the ARENA Initiative, a research project dedicated to overcoming the challenges of digital era disinformation and polarization. Over the past 5 years, ARENA has worked with Ukrainian journalists and sociologists to create media content about the country. Peter is an award-winning author specializing in the relationship between propaganda, culture, and society, whose books include Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, and This is Not Propaganda. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, presents documentaries on BBC Radio 4, and previously worked as a TV documentary director and producer for Discovery, the BBC, and others. My second quote tonight comes from Janine's deeply personal and revealing memoir, Ghosts by Daylight, from the author's early career assignment during the first Palestinian Intifada. In exchange with an Israeli lawyer defending Palestinians in military court, Janine was told to go everywhere, write everything, and gave her the following brief. If you have a chance to give a voice to people who do not have a voice, then you have an obligation. I ask you to ponder the propositions of these universal and sobering quotes later, following tonight's presentation. During the presentation, I urge you to turn off your electronic devices and join us in the moment. I promise you will be greatly rewarded with compelling stories and arguments for the need and urgency of our guests' critical and timely work, and with their hard-earned life experiences affecting them to always be in the moment. Please welcome the Reckoning Project's co-founders, Janine di Giovanni and Peter Pomerantsev.
Thank you all for coming. And thank you for that very kind introduction. Janine, you and I just got back from Lviv, where we were attending the Lviv Book Forum, and I see some familiar faces. But mostly we were there to train the next cohort of our Ukrainian colleagues who will be doing the very hard work of collecting testimonies about, in this case, focusing on the abduction of children. And it's actually really quite remarkable because we started this a year ago, just over a year ago. I think I called you the night of the full-scale invasion, or the next night. I didn't sleep several days, so they were all days, I suppose. And I'm trying to remember how this started. I mean, I just didn't know what I could do that could be meaningful, because journalism didn't feel meaningful anymore, and hasn't for a long time. And I think you kind of gave birth to this. I used the word birth in the video, but that was my sense, that you were birthing this project. I mean, how did that happen?
Good evening, and thank you so much for coming out to hear us, and thank you to the Ukraine Institute for hosting us. We're very honored to be here. So the Reckoning Project, I mean, I jokingly say with Peter, was born at my kitchen table on East 4th Street in Little Ukraine. Peter called me, and he was rightly incredibly upset. He was born in Kyiv and left as an infant, so Ukraine is incredibly close to your heart. And I come from a history of working in war zones for more than half my life. And I had developed this incredible sense of anger. More than anything, anger, bitterness, rage, that so many war criminals walked away completely with impunity. And as I said on the video, just disappeared into villages. And I knew from my experience, especially working in Bosnia, which was really, Martha Gellhorn once said, you can only love one war, the rest is responsibility. I don't know if I completely agree with that because I feel very, very attached to Ukraine. But Bosnia was my first real love, and it broke my heart to see what happened there and how few people were prosecuted for the terrible, terrible crimes. So Peter and I started, in a way, with that template. We wanted to go deeper than journalism. We wanted to have an impact, and we wanted to somehow cut through the inefficiency in the international justice system. And the way to do it suddenly was very clear to both of us. It was that there were all these incredible Ukrainian journalists that Peter had been working with for years, and they were on the front line, and they were witnessing these crimes in real time, but that the notes that they would take would not actually be admissible in war crime tribunals. So how could we take these really talented, brave, courageous Ukrainian reporters and train them to think like lawyers? And it wasn't really that big of a leap. So we started with an idea, and from there we moved very quickly. We actually started training in April 2022, right after Bucha, and we hit the ground running immediately. And I think one of the reasons we are effective is because we're not encumbered the way the UN or organizations are that are huge bureaucracies. We're tiny. We're a staff of 35 now. And we can move. You know, as Nataliya Gumenyuk said, when a town or a village is liberated, we're there right away. I'll go over to you, and then because I could talk about this all night, but I'll let you.
And tell me, I mean, the journalism I was always aware of, I mean, because I've been working with a lot of Ukrainian journalists, and the war started in 2014 for us. But it's the other stuff that's been a revelation. So I think from this film, probably didn't get a sense of how many people there are on the ground. There's 30 staff, but there's around 20 to 40 journalists in the field at any one point. But it was remarkable, and I'm sure the audience noticed, that the legal experts, Ibrahim and Raji, are from the Middle East. And I think that's incredibly important. So, and you brought them in. This was your pool of contacts. Tell me why you chose them specifically and how their experience relates to a conflict very far away from them.
Well, you heard Raji saying Putin started this in Chechnya, and that was a war, unfortunately, I also witnessed. I witnessed the fall of Grozny in February 2000, and the terror that came after when the Russians occupied and invaded. So he got away with it in Chechnya, and then he went to Georgia. He got away with it in Georgia, and then he went to Syria. Syria, I spent 8 years working in Syria on torture, writing a book, essentially called The Morning They Came for Us, about torture, and I called it The Morning They Came for Us because every single person I took a testimony from always said that their lives kind of were before and after, and it was always, you know, when they came to take me away, you know, before they had a life, and then when they were taken away, incarcerated, brutally tortured, they had a whole different life. They were never the same person again. So I chose these two Syrians. Raji had helped build the Syrian archive, but also he helped build the first Syrian war crimes tribunal in Koblenz, Germany. And I just told you this story recently, but I was recruiting the staff, and you know, Peter and I had to build from the kitchen table, build an entire staff of war crime investigators. We had no idea how to do this. I mean, Peter's run more NGOs than I have, but you know,
I've run 0 NGOs, so there you go.
You knew more about, you know, grants and government, working with government. Anyway, I worked for the UN, but I didn't know how to build a staff myself. Anyway, I met Raji in Berlin in a seedy coffee shop, and we both, you know, had been completely traumatized by the Syrian war. And he said to me, but why do you want to do this? I mean, why do you want to take on this huge challenge? And I said, and to my horror, because I didn't know him, I started crying. And I said, I'm so tired of seeing these guys walk away with it, you know, and the people that are left behind whose lives will never be the same again. And he put his hand on mine and he said, I will help you. And that was Raji. Ibrahim is an extraordinarily gifted British Syrian barrister who spent the past 10 years really, really trying to hammer down war crimes inside Syria. So I knew these two guys very much would understand Putin's tactics, and that they would understand me as well. You know, why I was had this compulsion to go after Kremlin war crimes. So that was the start of our little nucleus. And then, of course, Nataliya Gumenyuk, who's this extraordinary, talented, courageous Ukrainian journalist, brought the first group of researchers. And we trained them, and then we hit the ground running.
You mentioned there Chechnya, Syria, Ukraine, and sort of a method of war and a method of atrocities. So tell me what repeats, because I think that's something that's sometimes missing in our analysis of what's going on. We're talking about a repeat offender. We're talking about a military culture, a leader, maybe even a political culture that has a certain way of doing things. And tell me more about it. What have you seen repeat over and over again that makes it unique?
So war is much more than the battlefield or the military maneuvers. It's a strategy to destroy societies. Putin has a very clear strategy, especially in Ukraine, to destroy Ukrainian identity. To destroy Ukrainian identity. How do you do this? You do it first by attacking the family. Now, when we look very carefully, and we're submitting several legal testimonies and documents to various tribunals, as well as different UN mechanisms, the Human Rights Council, other people, about Putin's patterns, which I call Putin's gruesome playbook. It is, as Raji said, to subdue, subjugate, to basically demoralize a population completely, so then they can move in militarily because they've completely eradicated villages, family life. So one way of doing this, which we are the Reckoning Project is going to spend the next year very intently, is to take the children and bring them to Russia and try to destroy their Ukrainian identity by taking away their language, by taking away their books, by taking them away from their family units, by putting them in Russian camps where some of the young boys learn military maneuvers, but the other children learn Russian history. If you go at this level, if you begin at the very base level by children, by taking children, and you are trying to attack society in that way, then you completely demoralize the population. But it didn't happen that way in Ukraine because the Ukrainians refused to capitulate. So I think that Putin's strategies are basically against civilian population. You know, it's not just let's hit a military installation. It's let's hit a maternity hospital in Mariupol.
So that was, I think the word hospitals was in that little film, and a colleague of ours is currently writing a big piece and talking about the hit on the Mariupol maternity hospital. But again, I think what we've been able to do in The Reckoning is bring out how this is a pattern. It's happened in Syria and in Chechnya. So why go after hospitals? Why go after maternity hospitals? What you're saying is this is on purpose. It's not just collateral damage or an accident. This is actually a tactic.
No, absolutely. In Aleppo, the beautiful Silk Road city of Aleppo, which fell in December 2016, Putin joined the war in Syria in 2015. Before that, the opposition actually might have had a chance at winning. Putin came in with air power and basically just turned Aleppo into a parking lot, which is what he did in Grozny as well. It looked like a parking lot after they bombed it. So if you hit hospitals, basically, if you kill one doctor, you kill 100 people, because doctors in many ways are pillars of society. Of course, under the Geneva Convention, which you mentioned earlier, to attack humanitarian workers, journalists, or medical facilities is a war crime. Aleppo, by the time it fell, had basically one triage hospital. All of the pediatric hospitals, the gynecological hospitals, the maternity hospitals had been leveled. I spent a couple weeks in a triage unit, which later became a film, an extraordinary film called For Sama, which a young Syrian filmmaker made. And it was wonderful because she was working with us, but she was falling in love with the only doctor. And he wasn't actually even a doctor, he was a resident. He was a last year resident. He was the only, basically one of the few doctors left. And to live inside a hospital in a city, a country at war is an extraordinary humbling, tragic thing, because you see children that would live in normal circumstances die in front of you. You see doctors working without anesthetic, without antibiotics, without electricity. You know, they wore headlamps. I have a friend who is a brain surgeon who worked underground in Aleppo because every time the hospital was above ground, Putin's bombs would destroy it. So this guy worked underground, taking shrapnel out of children's brains for 2 years. He almost went completely mad. So yes, you're saying, is this a strategy? Is it a Yes, absolutely. Because you hit hospitals and then basically you take out the pillar of society, you take out the one place that people feel safe, well, not really safe, but where they can go to for aid. And it's a way of forcing the people to capitulate and to be on their knees. It's the same with Ukraine last winter, hitting electricity grids. I mean, there was no military reason for that other than to make people absolutely miserable and frightened and cold. So if you do things like this, these are very strategic wartime crimes that go beyond any kind of just or unjust wars. These are crimes that directly affect civilians.
Listening to all this, I mean, it's also apparent that there's a statement being made about impunity, and you use the word impunity a lot. And the statement is also, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to get away with this. When we were just in Lviv, we presented a book by The Reckoning. The Reckoning were also thinking about cultural products. We're developing documentary plays, working with some fiction filmmakers as well. And when we presented the book, there was a question from the audience. And it's a question I often hear in Ukraine about, you guys talk about justice and ending impunity. Well, is it actually going to happen? And why are we different? Why are we going to be different from the Bosnian experience or the Syrian experience? Or how can we be different? I mean, what if impunity wins?
I think we're different because what we're trying to do is help prosecutors by basically presenting a file that has already been verified and that the statements have already been taken. So the difference, Bosnia, and I often use this example, but it's a very telling and very cruel example. There were up to 20,000 women who were raped in these awful rape camps that were in eastern Bosnia, cities like Foča. And literally, the Bosnian Serbs took these women between the ages of, young 11, 12-year-olds to 60-year-old women, and they put them in these school auditoriums or, buildings, and some of them were raped up to 16 times a day, many of the women with the intention that they would get pregnant. So this would break the gene pool, so they wouldn't no longer be Muslim babies, they'd be half Serb. Same thing in Rwanda, by the way, during the terrible genocide in 1994. So it took so long for the investigators to get to Bosnia on the ground after the war that these guys walked away. They changed their identity, they changed their names, they were protected by their buddies. And then Srebrenica happened in 1995. And Srebrenica is one of the greatest traumas of my life because we saw it coming from 1993. And I remember sitting in the office of the president of Bosnia, Izetbegovic, and we were on radios because the only way we could communicate with people inside Srebrenica was with radios, and they were saying, in the name of God, do something. And of course, we know the UN did nothing. Not only did they do nothing, they separated the men from the women, and the men were led off into the forest, and 8,000 of them were slaughtered. So, I forget the question. How did I started rambling?
No, I mean, I remember.
About impunity.
I remember.
Oh yeah, Bosnia.
Yeah, why are we going to be different?
Bosnia, a handful of people were prosecuted for the rapes in Bosnia, a handful from Srebrenica. If you talk to prosecutors, they'll say, the ICTY, the International Tribunal for Yugoslavia, was a success. We got Milosevic, we got Mladic, we got Karadzic. But they didn't get the guys that did it. And I have female acquaintances who were in those camps, who gave birth to children out of rape. And they're still in the villages, and they see their rapists every single day. And one woman said to me, I drop my eyes in shame, not him. So we don't ever want that to happen in Ukraine. And the other example is Syria, which is a very different example. Now in Syria, everyone had smartphones, right? So as the Putin's bombs were coming down on Aleppo, everyone ran out of their house and took video footage. Maybe not very professionally, but they did it. Everyone then, basically, all of that evidence was gathered along with miles and miles and miles of paperwork and put into a villa at the United Nations in Geneva under a mechanism called the IIIM. You could look it up online. It was something that passed through the General Assembly as a way of basically going through all these war crimes. But there is so much there, and it needs verification. All of that video, everything needs to be verified. Those papers need to be verified. I was told by a prosecutor it would take decades. And the same thing in Rwanda. If you needed to go through 1 million people were murdered in Rwanda in 3 months. 1 million people. It would have taken 40 years. So part of the reason the Reckoning Project came to be was I had this idea about the Gacaca courts of Rwanda. Does anyone know about the Gacaca courts? It basically also stems from the Truth and Reconciliation Committees of South Africa. So the Gacaca courts were basically courts. Gacaca means field, and it was, you would have the perpetrator, the victim, and the village chief in the middle, having these kind of homemade courts, which would help speed up justice. And they were, there were issues, there was some corruption, but they helped speed justice up. So the Reckoning Project, I'm talking a lot to get to the point, is a way of speeding up justice by having people on the ground immediately, by verifying it with our genius Raji and many kind of tools that he uses. They're verified. So we can then help prosecutors in Ukraine. We work with the Office of the Prosecutor General, but we also work with various other international mechanisms. We hand them a file. It's verified. Here's the mapping. Here's the statements. And it basically helps them move forward a lot faster. So we're just one little pearl on a string of pearls to get to justice, but we're making it that much faster. And the hope is, because we're not encumbered with bureaucracy, and we're a tiny but incredibly nimble and very able team, we're very mighty, we can do it faster.
Now, a lot of the stuff we're seeing, I would describe as sort of classic atrocities, torture, indiscriminate bombing of civilian objects. But there's also this sort of like more difficult themes, which I don't think they're defined legally very well, but which I think you say are very, very important to Russia's tactics. So kidnapping children, that's obviously a part of genocide. But this re-education, indoctrination, also other things that people are talking about in the context of this war, ecocide, the blowing up of the Kakhovka Dam, and then the thing that I'm personally obsessed with, which is sort of the legal culpability of propagandists. Do you think there's an opportunity for Ukraine sort of to be a turning point where we start to define a lot of these crimes? Because I'm not even sure they're crimes technically, but they're such a massive part of what Russia is doing. I mean, blowing up the Kakhovka Dam was incredibly effective. I saw how people here reacted when they were faced with the biblical sight of whole villages swamped. Everybody here retreated. They're like, oh, we can't deal with this sort of evil. This is too big. And they started going, well, we need to sort of work out what happened. And is this really a crime? Almost seems the bigger the crime that Russia commits, the smaller the willpower to resist it gets. But tell me a bit about that. So let's take indoctrination, because I was just in the East a lot doing research for The Reckoning and for some magazine articles. And really this attempt to sort of break Ukrainian society to commit enforced re-education, Russification. How can we start embracing this topic, and how does it echo with other tactics like that you've seen across the world? I mean, what's the difference between education and re-education? And we live in America, and all the time there's a debate about, American universities are indoctrinating kids. I mean, what's the difference between what Russia does or what other regimes like it do and education? How do we even start to define this crime?
So Peter and I were just on a panel in Lviv talking about this, and it suddenly occurred to me, unfortunately, I've spent decades working with child soldiers, and I suddenly realized that the indoctrination process of them was quite similar to what Putin and the Kremlin are doing with Ukrainian kids. Maybe not as brutal in terms of making them. Okay, so I'll give you an example. In Sierra Leone, terrible 14-year civil war, kids as young as 6 or 7, where they would go through, the rebels would go through, they'd burn the village, they'd kill everyone, and then they'd take the kids. And part of their indoctrination was they had to go back to the village and find whoever was left of their family and kill them. Now that meant that these kids severed all ties with their original culture, with their tribe, with their family. They were then loaded up with drugs and indoctrinated with hate. And their trauma was used to create hatred, to turn them into fighters who could go into battle fearlessly. And these were tiny little kids. After the war ended, I spent quite a bit of time in unredoctrination camps, or whatever it is that you try to reverse the indoctrination. And one of them was run by Spanish Jesuit priests. And they told me that before the age of 9, children don't have conscience of what is right and what is wrong, and therefore they were able to commit these horrible acts. But the Reckoning Project were among the first to document these Ukrainian kids that were being taken to Russia to be adopted. And as we dig into it, what we discover is that they change their names, right? That's the first thing. They take away their Ukrainian names, give them Russian names. They immerse them into Russian history, Russian culture, Russian songs, and they basically try to scrape away their identity and create a whole new identity. So we're just beginning this whole, it's going to take us a year. I think it will take us forever. But we're looking at this in terms of trying to build a case of whether or not this is a war crime, connected to cultural genocide, because it is trying to eradicate a people.
Which isn't actually a legal term, as I've been told repeatedly by our legal team. But there's more to it than that. I mean, you make this very interesting parallel. They're taking these kids, they are, let's use this term, indoctrination, in order to then make child soldiers out of them. It's remarkable reading some of the evidence of what's going on in Crimea, in the occupied territories in Donbass, where the aim is not simply to Russify the children, but then to draft them as quickly as possible into the army. And again, I think it's important not to make too many assumptions, but there seems to be a pattern that they are then among the first troops that are sent into battle. So literally going and killing your fellow countrymen. So there's an echo there of this horror of going to your village to kill your parents, to sever ties. It is this let's take them and make them into our shock troops to really cut off any chance of there being a coherent nation in the future. So it's they seem very different contexts, Crimea and Sierra Leone, but there seems to be something that repeats, which is deeply nefarious and weirdly not captured in current legal codes very clearly. And that's where I think the media work that we do sort of comes in as well. You know, through the media work that we do, which is very in-depth storytelling, we don't just document existing crimes. I think over the next year we'll be exploring what are these crimes that are yet undefined, and what is the process that's used to achieve them. It's been very interesting for me in the Reckoning project to work with lawyers for the first time. Some of my best friends are lawyers, but certainly in my media work, I was always taught to see lawyers as somebody that I do not cooperate with. If lawyers come and ask you for your notes, you say never. I do not reveal my sources. But it's been very interesting finding that we do have a common ground, which is truth and justice. And I do want to go back to sort of the philosophy of the Reckoning and where it stands in kind of this broader context of how do we fight these sorts of regimes. I've been very frustrated for a long time with what media is meant to do. You know, we're meant to expose evil, hold the powerful accountable of the truth, and they're meant to kind of, you know, retreat in horror from the truth, like sort of a vampire that's been shown a piece of garlic. But these days, like, the powerful don't care about the truth. They sort of take the garlic and eat it. And go, oh, lovely, thank you, and just walk away. And how can, you know, civil society, media, how can we have an impact? Is this the future? Do we need to start teaming up with lawyers, prosecutors? I don't know. Do we have to start building these connections? Because I don't know. I've been painfully aware of the limitations of journalism for a while.
And painfully aware of the limitations of the law. So I think what's really interesting, and what we've been told by the many lawyers and prosecutors who are on our board, is that this is the future. Civil society working alongside the legal process is really the way that we're going to hasten tribunals coming into being, getting the perpetrators to the dock. I mean, I think that there's two roads we can go. We can either take the Bosnia road and wait years until the Ukraine war is over, then get people on the ground, begin to investigate. And by the way, we're not forensic anthropologists. We don't dig graves. We do human testimonies. And that in itself is something quite new. We developed our own methodology with Raji and Ibrahim, and we train our researchers. Most of all, I mean, our overlying mantra is do no harm, meaning that you cannot re-traumatize. I think the battery's going on. You cannot re-traumatize someone you're interviewing. So often, and you're going to see this now on television with the terrible war going on in the Middle East, journalists aren't the most sensitive when they're on the scene of atrocities. They'll, you know, what happened? What do you feel? I've seen it countless times. I remember being in Iraq and seeing kids that were completely incinerated and having TV crews like shove microphones in their faces. You know, what happened? Tell us what happened. We can't interview people who are actively traumatized because their testimonies will not be used in court. So we have to train our researchers to, above all, be incredibly careful when they're working with victims of these crimes. Sexual violence is a whole other thing. We're about to embark on this project with children. Interviewing children is, again, you need to have psychologists or social workers there. Very, very careful training. But getting back to your point, it really is that I think the future is civil society, groups like the Reckoning Project, beginning to work alongside lawyers, prosecutors, investigators to hasten justice, to quicken justice. So we do not have another Bosnia or Rwanda situation.
It's not just civil society or media and lawyers, which is, you know, this case, but, you know, it's investigators working with activists, working with people who can pressure governments as well. It's sort of going through all the links in the chain in order to achieve an effect, which is kind of the opposite of what I was brought up with, which was like you guys, you go and expose, or you go and make your nice films, or tell your nice stories, and then the marketplace of ideas will deal with it all. And at one point you just realize that our whole theory of how you were meant to fight evil was wrong. And I do see the reckoning as part of a whole moment that really thinks about how we fight injustice and authoritarians in a much more in a much more punchy way, I suppose. I wanted to open up to our audience who have been sort of like just watching your faces as Janine tells her stories has been quite an experience. You are an amazing storyteller. I was just thinking, I've never met anybody who combines sort of beauty and grace and horror quite so in one package. I'm like it really is quite something. And I do listen to you all night often, and it's amazing. But if anybody has questions, my godmother has a question. We're keeping it in the family. Please introduce yourselves as you.
Yes, I'm Marta Zahikevich, emigre from a German DP camp and grew up here in New York. Thank you so much for just this amazing work that you do. And yes, you're quite amazing to listen to. I have two questions. I have a lot of questions, but let me just start with these two. You say that you are focused on getting testimony from individuals, right? And that individual has to point to a specific perpetrator. It has to find out who did this act. Is there does it have to be that way? Is there any way of finding the perpetrator, like the military unit, who everyone sort of noticed there's some military unit that's speaking in Russian, or their commander, or Putin himself, or what? You can do that. And also, do you work with, there's 35 people, and this is a massive project, and you're trying to not just interview people, but also there's some logistics going about finding perpetrators. Do you work with anybody else? Like the army looks for perpetrators, and they use sort of cell phone, face recognition. They have all kinds of techniques and lots of stuff available. I mean, how do you get access to something like that?
I'll start with talking about the perpetrators, and then Peter can talk about the fancy tools, because I think you know a bit more about OSINT than me. So in our templates and our training, what we look for is details. So for instance, Bucha. After Bucha happened, many of our witnesses would say, and we'd say to them, what language were they speaking? What was their accent? What did they have chevrons? The tank came down the street. There was a ribbon tied to it. What color was the ribbon? We're trying to get as much granular detail as possible so that after it's verified and it goes to our legal team, they then begin to look for patterns. So they might not be able to pick out the exact soldier unless there was an ID, but we're trying to establish different patterns that happen, whether it's torture, deportation. Most of the cases we get are indiscriminate attacks on civilians. So it could be something like people trying to escape a burning village and being shot upon. That happened in Irpin and Bucha. As people were trying to get away in their cars, they deliberately targeted them, even though they had white flags. So we look for these kind of patterns. And from those patterns, that is how we begin to build cases. So we're working on one case of torture, and we're using the legal mechanism of universal jurisdiction, which is it's not a new concept in the law, but it's something that was used during the Syrian war to bring perpetrators to trial in Germany. We're looking to open that up in Argentina. We're also looking to do things which are quite innovative to charge Putin on terrorism charges. So terrorism charges like akin to the Islamic State. So yes, of course, if we can find individual cases, and that's what the OPG, the Office of the Prosecutor General in Kyiv, they have, when we give our files over, they will look more in depth to try to find individual. We're looking for patterns, tools.
Look.
Talk about Raji's tool.
Well, there's a lot of excitement about tools, about, face recognition tools and all sorts of other tech-related things. It's been fascinating for me talking to the lawyers who basically say, that's all lovely, that's not a case. Until you have the witness testimony, nothing else really matters. They're kind of nice, they're nice garnishes, but the main dish is the witness testimonies. There's attempts to change that, and there's attempts to make sort of what's known as open source data good enough to use in courts. But the law is actually very traditional. It needs people, and those people have to be credible. And so the way you initially collect the testimony is the key. And everything will implode if you do that wrong. And you can then add the other stuff. I'm not a lawyer, there's lawyers in the room, sorry if I got that wrong. But that's the way the lawyers explained it to us. It was quite shocking to me, because I thought as well, look, we have so many tools these days. But no, it comes down to something very, very human and a way of dealing with truth and trust. But let's take something like, one of the things we'll be looking at this year is the legal accountability of Russian propagandists. So testimonies are very important of the victims. To what extent were the torturers using the language of propaganda? To what extent did their language change when the propaganda changed? Did the amount of atrocities increase when the propaganda shifted? So that's very important. But obviously then, if you can do the full set of linkages, you're going to work with many, many different partners. So, you'll want a whistleblower from the Russian media system. You'll want maybe some nice emails will fall into our hands that reveal the coordination between the Russian media and the Russian military. So, of course, when you build a full case, you think about it like, all the witnesses you're bringing to the stand. But the core of it, the absolute core and the heartbeat of it, are these very old-fashioned practice of human testimonies. That's what it is.
And you'd be surprised how it's actually really laborious. There are all these fancy tools like facial recognition, but actually the testimonies are something we go through with a red pencil and look for, very carefully, Raji, Peter, myself, Ibrahim, and the whole legal team. And, I literally mark it up, precedents or other cases, or, we're trying to establish patterns. We're trying to look through all of the testimonies. And, often, like for instance, we just got a batch of the testimonies from the flooding of the dam. And, what I kept noticing over and over from the testimonies was that every time they tried to get help, the Ukrainians tried to get help, and the Russian emergency services came through, and they'd say, oh, sure, we're here to help you, but there's no room on this boat for you to get on. And there were about 4 or 5 different accounts of this from different people giving testimony, that they tried to get help, and the Russians said, sure, we're here to help you, but there's no room on this boat. And so I kept marking it up saying, is there some kind of precedent to this, that, they deliberately left civilians in peril? So a lot of it actually is much more, even in this age of computers and algorithms, and you still need to put in the labor, the brain time in marking it up in an old-fashioned way.
Even though this morning Raji presented a new tool that will help us do that. So that, look, technology changes a lot, of course it does. But there's just a human core at the center of it all. Does anybody else have questions?
Yeah.
I'll just say it. How does the law and how do you distinguish between somebody who is, I think you use the term, actively traumatized, and somebody who has been traumatized? I mean, current psychology would suggest trauma continues.
Can you give her the mic again? Did you say, how do we know if someone's traumatized?
So how does the law distinguish, and how do you distinguish between somebody who's actively traumatized and somebody who was traumatized and is no longer? That's not, I mean, current psychology would not really recognize that distinction.
There's a trauma specialist here. Do you want to take, I mean, I can answer from what we do, but would you like to?
I can take the question, but I don't know how you do it. So.
Okay, so for example, if a traumatized, someone who is traumatized, often their sense of time isn't linear, it's not correct. So in the immediate aftermath of the Kramatorsk, the train station, where 66 people were killed, 66 people, hundreds injured. We didn't send people to go immediately to the aftermath of that while people were sitting by the side of the road bleeding and completely traumatized from seeing family members ripped apart by a bomb. Waited a bit, then worked with people, often not just once to get the testimony, so it might be 2 or 3 or 4 times. And we reject a lot of things. Like, for instance, Raji and I were in Kharkiv, and there had just been a bombing in an apartment building, and there was a very old man whose entire apartment had been destroyed. Or he was one of the only people left living there, and we sat down to begin taking his testimony, and very quickly we realized that he was just, it wasn't even age, it was just he was unable to give a testimony that would stand up in court. So it really, a lot of it is a matter of instinct, I'd have to say. I worked in war zones for 33 years, so I worked with so many traumatized people. I've done a lot of research into it. I myself have been extensively studied by numerous psychiatrists, and I do not have PTSD for some remarkable reason. So basically, yes.
But when does the law say, sorry, we're not going to accept this testimony, this person was traumatized?
The prosecutors will. They'll just throw it out. They will not, the prosecutors are very strict about what they actually take. So even what we give them, a lot of what we give them, they probably won't take. So of our 350 testimonies that we have now, I don't even want to say a number, but I would say maybe, 1/4 of those will be used, and they're good testimonies and they're solid. But they're unbelievably picky, and they should be, because they have to win a case. Do you want to say something?
I was going to ask you another question, because we are the International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, and we work with Ukrainian mental health professionals and lawyers, and actually some journalists too. I think we met in the previous meeting here with journalists. But I wanted to ask you another question. Part of what we are doing, and we are working also with the International Criminal Court, is exercise what we call reparative justice. That is justice that is not only about the outcome, that is guilt or innocence, but justice that considers the relationship with the victim from the first moment to after the judgment, good or bad, that should be reparative, that the relationship itself should have a meaningful human value to the victim or to the witness, rather than just be a testimony giver. So a lot of that is multidisciplinary work, just like what you're describing, right? Lawyers working with psychologists, working with children's specialists, etc. Do you have, you mentioned you work with lawyers, do you also have mental health professionals on your team? Because I know that for us, the issue is not only whether the witness is traumatized, but not, as you mentioned before, not to traumatize the victim further, and in fact to be responsible to even refer the victim elsewhere when they need help that you cannot give. So can you elaborate more on that? Because clearly I came here in order to hear you to see what do you guys do that
We work with the DART Center.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah, so we work very closely with the DART Center.
Yeah, I created the ISTSS with the DART Center. Yes.
The DART Center is at Columbia University. They do excellent work. But also with this children's project, for instance, which we just started. We're in the mapping stage of it. We just trained 15 new researchers. So we're going to be working with psychologists alongside when the children are interviewed, because and you know this, that you can so easily re-traumatize someone by making them go back into their memory. And if they're not, I'm not a psychologist, but I've had EMDR. I know how it works. I know what trauma is. I've lived with people with severe trauma. I've interviewed people who have gone through desperate things. But we know that we have to be really responsible for the law, for your point, Zoe, absolutely, so that our testimonies are airtight, and we want them to be used in court. But also for the whole pretense of do no harm, because that is, above all, really important to us. And there are many groups working in Ukraine right now, and some of them are not using, not everyone uses the same protocol or the same methodology. It's kind of our goal at the Reckoning Project to bring people together so that we're sharing methodology, sharing protocol, especially things like sexual violence, so delicate. Yeah, it would be great. So we could talk more about it after, but thank you.
I think implicit in that is this idea of what is justice. I mean, there's the justice of The Hague, which is meant to sort of come down like a... But it's sort of almost fetishized. It's like meant to be this sort of like judgment day that's going to come down from the heavens and resolve everything. And we know from the history of Nuremberg that a lot of people were deeply unsatisfied. And we talk about this a lot. How do we sort of broaden the gates of justice? So it's not just about The Hague. It's not even just about the dock. We can also think about, economic justice, the justice of sanctions, just the justice of representation. But I think that's I think that's something we'll be thinking about a lot as we move forward. How do we think about justice in more than just the strict legal sense?
So we look at trauma in Ukraine as transgenerational, going back to the Holodomor and the endless bloodshed there. And the same in Bosnia, the war ended 30-something years ago, but the generations that will live on. Sarajevo was an open asylum at one point. Everyone there was deeply traumatized by living through 3 years of siege.
My name is Nataliya Gumenyuk, and my daughter is a writer. She lives in Berlin, but she wrote about the Syrians after the war, and she wrote about the mental health issues, and it was published in the Washington Post. It's about the Syrians who were undergoing trauma, and it was a very interesting article.
Thank you.
Maybe someone else, because you already had a question, then come back to you.
Well, I was wondering, I can probably keep up mind. Once you establish a pattern, how do you initiate a prosecution? What's the process for realizing that you have a clear pattern in place and then moving that to the next level where some sort of action is taken about it? Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Dean Temple. I didn't introduce myself. Thank you.
So that's a question for Ibrahim, who's not here right now, but I think basically...
Talk to our lawyers, okay?
Yeah. I think what he would say is that he's building, let's say the torture case, right? We're going through our archives. We call our testimonies that are locked down in an archive. And then they're codified to basically be able to separate where this torture took place. Was it during incarceration? Was it, when people were being transferred. And then he will build it into a very specific case, and depending on whether we're working with universal jurisdiction or the crime of aggression, the court of aggression, which we're also working with various people there, or the prosecutor's office in Kyiv, or the national courts. Because, you know, we feel very strongly that the Ukrainian justice system is very strong, and we should try to be as helpful as we can with them, not just the ICC. Because after all, the ICC doesn't have the greatest record in the world. You know, we feel we're working within the Office of the Prosecutor General, and we're trying to, you know, establish ties with various prosecutors. And you saw the prosecutor in Kharkiv, didn't you, on your last trip? Yeah. But the very specific legal question, we'd have to have Ibrahim, who's now in London asleep.
No, that's great. I mean, it's great to actually understand the connections that you have to the other courts and to the specific courts. And so I suppose you look at each scenario and says this applies most to this type of court.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like I've listened to him speak. I can try to replicate what he says. It's exactly that. What is the legal strategy? Is it the easy case in an easy jurisdiction because this country has got a great track record of torture, or should we do the really complicated case, holding propagandists accountable, for example, which has only been done a couple of times, in a really friendly country like Sweden, for example? So exactly, when you're talking about universal jurisdiction, you're going, which case fits where for its legal effect, but also for its, and this is what Ibrahim is, I think, unique as a lawyer as, it's sort of effect on the public discourse. Where you open it, will that strengthen the idea that this is a NATO war? Or if you open it in Gambia, which has incredibly strong human rights laws for various reasons, is that actually a very good idea? Because you're telling a story that this is about universal crimes and not just a regional horror. So there are so many factors, and all of them are exciting. And I don't know, the lawyers that we talk to, and that you talk to even more than me, they can tell that what Russia is doing is trying to discredit the meaning of what they do, and they seem to have got a certain energy around this war. I think they see it as the stakes are very high. You know, we can't let leaders like Putin keep on getting away with it. We're kind of at a breaking point. And they're excited because the opportunities to bring cases are greater than ever. Anyway, that's my sense. I mean, you talk to them a lot more.
Yeah, there's also the court of public opinion. So what's really important is that we keep the Ukrainian story alive, especially now with the Middle East about to blow sky high, and we need to keep the attention on Ukraine, because who pays the prosecutors? Taxpayers' money, right? So right now we've got a real problem with the global South, the so-called global South, who are basically see the Ukrainian war as a NATO war, as a Western alliance, and that it's a kind of European war. You know, in Argentina, in Africa, in the Middle East to an extent, certainly in Latin America, they do not see Ukraine as a priority, and we should be pouring taxpayers' money into it. So that's where our media comes in, by, you know, engaging writers in Latin America to write about the atrocities in Ukraine. It then influences the public, which is what we're trying to do, you know, to keep the public on our side, so to speak, so that the prosecutor in Argentina that we're going to work with will open the case. So it's all a strategy. It's the legal strategy, but it's also the media strategy. And that's in a way how we're unique, because that never really hasn't been done before, but it should be.
Question, is there any possibility of publishing a book, those memories and the documentations of these traumatic events and traumatic experiences, historical memory?
Yeah, I mean, no, that's a huge part of what we do. There's already one book out in Ukrainian based on kind of our first year of work. I mentioned there's a documentary play that's being written, but no, the idea is that we're thinking about cultural products even more as we move forward. Year number one was very much based on journalism, but as we move forward, no, completely, and there's lots of very creative ways to engage with the archive. From a kind of literary point of view, there is a sort of almost, there's a fierceness to the detail and a coolness as well that you don't usually find in a lot of human rights reporting, which is fascinating from a sort of a storytelling point of view. So I think there just sort of the writer bit in me gets very, very excited as I think about how many talented writers from many places could work with this material.
So there's the whole issue of memorials, and that's something this year we're going to begin working on. Is, historical memory, what is remembered, how people will remember the war, what happened. It's incredibly important to document it and to lock it down. And so in a way, our archives, they're used for legal purposes, but they will also be used as a way of ensuring that the truth remains the truth. Peter's an expert in disinformation. I always say there's another level of what we do, and that is to counter Kremlin disinformation. Because I always tell the researchers, facts don't lie. So if you've got something nailed down and it's been verified, then they cannot come back at you and say, this didn't happen. Look, the genocide in Srebrenica, even now, even though, we have the graves, we have the bones, we have the forensic research, there are still people who say, including a Nobel Prize winner for literature, who says that it didn't happen. It was a military battle. These were not civilians that were marched in the forest and gunned down and thrown into mass graves. So, in a way, it's ensuring that the truth remains the truth.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Elif. I'm a writer. I'm here because I saw you guys in Lviv. I come from sort of a journalism background, and I'm just so interested in the idea of retraining journalists to be useful. I just feel like there's sort of a received idea that journalism has in the past years, because of disinformation and because of these new tools, we have to think differently, and journalism has stopped. But listening to your experiences that you've had since the war in Yugoslavia, which was long before, it sort of feels like journalism was never designed to hold people accountable. So I've just been, the whole time you've been talking, I've been wondering, what was, just from a big picture, what was journalism even designed to do? And the whole idea that you're retraining people to not stick a microphone in the face of the most incinerated person, but rather to think about, who was a good observer, who noticed the chevron that was on the person's coat. I was just wondering if that, through the retraining work that you've been doing, if you could talk a little bit more about what kind of shift in mentality it involves in teaching journalists to work that way, and also how that's made you think about your own past as journalists and the future of journalism more generally. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I keep on sitting down. So I'm even worse. I made documentaries and reality shows. And the reality shows were the moral thing I did. The most immoral thing I did was sensitive documentaries with traumatized people. And my job for many years, which I deeply despised but found fascinating, was to take traumatized people, make them feel that I really cared about them, and get them to cry on camera. And I got quite good at it. And at the moment when they would cry, just give a little pat up the butt of my cameraman, get closer now, that's when you get close. And there's a wonderful book by a Polish-British documentary maker, Agnieszka Piotrowska, who was so appalled by what she'd done that she did this for many years. She wrote a very good book about it, academic book, and now tries to train documentary makers to actually make documentaries in an ethical way. And she thinks there's a way of doing it. And I actually agree with her. I think what you do is bring people into the process. So you're not exploiting them. They become co-creators. They have control over it. If they are talking about something traumatic, they're completely in charge. So I think there's a way around. But definitely that's what I was told, and that was good filmmaking. And that's the classy filmmaking. That's the stuff that gets you BAFTAs and pre-Italias. Reality shows are moral. Everybody in a reality show knows what they're doing. Everybody who's in a reality show knows exactly what they're meant to play. You don't have to force people. Here we were exploiting people, and I kind of quit documentary making after making a film about a series of girls who got caught up in a cult and committed suicide. and spending a long time with their parents. And after that, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. So, but this has been refreshing because I think we are finding ways to do this which are moral, where people are empowered, where we're not exploiting them. And part of it is, you're quite right, it is not running up to them with a camera and saying, you know, how many, you know, tell me about the rape, you know? So I don't know, that Janine can do the details. What I find fascinating is that you don't do that. The fact you already don't do that, when usually your priority as a journalist is to do precisely that, is already such a huge shift. So yes, you're going around things time, you're thinking about the do no harm, you're putting the witness first. Already just getting into that headspace is actually quite a big shift. But Janine can go into the details, but thank you for raising that, because that's, maybe there is a way to save our profession, but it does require a huge shift.
Did you have a second part to your question?
Sorry, I just kidnapped that question.
It's
just very dear to me.
I came of age in the golden age of journalism. I worked for the British press when it was really good. I worked for the Sunday Times and then the Times of London, and I was really fortunate because I didn't have to get scoops. You know, I was kind of allowed, like I was thought of as a kind of weirdo, so they'd give me some money and a satellite phone, and they let me disappear and by the way, there were no cell phones then or internet. So literally, I'd like disappear in a village in Kosovo where the entire village of women had been taken and put in a rape camp, and I could spend 3 months working with people solely on that. So that's the kind of, you know, spoiled background in journalism I had, that I could spend weeks, months, years to write about these stories. When journalism began changing after 2008, I just realized I can't do this. You know, the pressure to kind of get scoops, 24-hour news. My friends who were great television journalists who found themselves chained to the satellite dish. You know, they couldn't. Last night I was watching someone on MSNBC. It was 3:30 in the morning in Tel Aviv, and I thought, I know how that guy feels, you know, getting called up at 4 a.m. to talk to Wolf Blitzer, you know, and 24-hour news, rolling news has killed journalism. I decided that I had to kind of get out, and I went back and got another degree outside of, I had 2 degrees in comparative literature like you, and I got another degree in international law, and because I realized, like, all the work I've been doing all these years on war crimes, I need to frame it in a way that I can make it, you know, I can do something with it. So I don't know. I mean, you know, people always say to us, but maybe you'll never get these guys to court. And I just feel like we're on to something. We found a niche that's really important to bridge, because there are so many journalists that come to us. We only use Ukrainians, by the way, because of giving them back agency over their justice system. But, you know, many, many, many really talented journalists have come to us and said, you know, can you train us? And we're not trainers. So I really want to make that clear. We're not, there's many organizations that train journalism. We are a war crimes unit, you know, and we are gathering human testimony to be used in the court of law, but also to build a lasting memorial of what happened in Ukraine. We're going to be there for a long time. There's 110,000 incidents, and, you know, we just got back from Kyiv and Lviv, and my head is spinning at how much work we have to do, how many more teams we need to build to get them out in the field. But when we achieve what we want to achieve in Ukraine, I really want to take the model to other places in the world where there's massive impunity. Yemen, Syria, Israel, Palestine. I mean, Gaza is going to be a place where we're going to be working for years. Many, many other places. Africa, all over Africa, Latin America. And I think it will be a model that will be used, a template that can be honed and refined and used to bring us a little bit closer to justice that victims and survivors deserve.
But journalism hasn't it sort of reinvented itself a few times over the centuries, and maybe this is one of those moments. And I don't think the old model of journalism disappears, I think that's fine. But I think there's a lot more that we can be doing in that relationship between information and democracy. And I think it is a time of innovation. The bad guys are innovating a lot, so I think we need to innovate too. They kind of worked out a lot of things that, that was meant to make them vulnerable. They're getting badder and they're getting better, and we're still think we can do the kind of Bernstein Washington Post thing. Ha-ha, Mr. Trump, we found out the truth. Yeah, and
again, what Raji said, Putin got away with it in Chechnya, and that emboldened him to do even worse in Syria. He got away with it in Syria, and that has made him even bolder to do what he's done in Ukraine. So it's really if he gets away with it in Ukraine, what will he do next?
He won't get away with it because we have the Reckoning Project to deal with that.
Well, no, we have the ZSU, which is the main reason he won't get away with it.
I do have a couple of questions. One is a continuation on the journalist notion. The various journalists and researchers that come to do the work that you do they know of you already, or do you go out and try to recruit people who are like-minded? And do they have any kind of particular specialty, whether it's in propaganda, whether it's in rape, or whether it's in ecocide, anything like that? Or do they kind of do it all individually?
Most of them are investigative journalists. This time we got 3 lawyers who came to us. So we do recruit them. They have heard, most of the time they have heard of us in Ukraine. We're very new, but we are getting a reputation. Their journalists know how to ask questions, but so do social workers. Social workers are really, really good in the field. I've worked with first responders, so like firemen, doctors. In Iraq and Syria, I worked with them to try to recognize war crimes and to take, to take testimonies. So they come from a variety of background. But the other thing that's really important is many of them are local. So they're from the villages or the area, they're from the occupied territories, and there's a trust factor. And that's another reason why we only use Ukrainians. Although we have one who is, who's actually, but speaks Russian rather than Ukrainian. It's important that they have that local, so that they build trust within the community.
No, that's very good. The World Monuments Fund does a similar kind of process in Ukraine where they work with local craftspeople, local historians to work with the community at that point. You're cold, so we're going to be ending in a moment. My final question is: Do you engage governments as well, like policymakers, government administration?
Yeah.
Okay.
Whether it be in Ukraine, the EU, or in the United States, and how does that work in terms of furthering that message for policy?
Again, talk to our lawyers, but yes, of course we do. And again, I'll go back to one project we're developing now, the legal accountability of propagandists. It would be wonderful to bring some of these sort of genocidal pursuing propagandists to account, but if one can show that they and their media and the people who fund their media are directly responsible for war crimes, then you do go to the policymakers and go, why are these TV channels still showing in Europe? Why are advertisers still appearing on them? So there's so much, once you've really proven, the connection between crimes and those responsible, there's lots of options, many, many options, and some of them are in the policy space. Not all of them are purely in courts of law.
Well, I think that should wrap it up today with someone getting very cold up front. Janine, Peter, thank you ever so much for coming to us. Your work is patriotic on an international scale and Herculean. At this time, I ask the audience to join us for a glass of wine and for further engagement. Thank you. Thank you for coming.